Hey, how's it going, buddy?
Great. So yeah, what sort of questions do you have about like the decolonization thing? I understand you watched Professor Flowers' video on it. I mean, I wouldn't say
Fuck,
I
no, I
agree with
didn't. I
her
didn't
on
watch shit on
everything,
it.
but
Explain it to me.
just to explain decolonization from the beginning. I thought you
Yeah,
wanted to
what does
ask
it
her
mean?
questions.
Well, I'll ask questions, but you gotta explain it to me first. I don't even know what I'm asking questions about.
Well, you watched her video, right?
No,
I saw you watch her video, or at least a part of it.
I was watching the um, God, what was it? It was Noah's video on Vosh's video on Professor
Okay.
Flowers' video. I think is what I watched.
So you didn't watch her video? You wanted to talk to her about like her beliefs on this?
Yeah, videos are just like really boring because I feel like
Okay.
people in videos aren't necessarily the same as when you're just having a conversation with them. And rather than like watch a video and be like, well, what about that or that or that? It's just easier to talk to somebody and have them just explain what they mean
Okay.
or think.
So
Yeah.
like, what do you know about like just colonialism in general? Like, do I need to start from like the very beginning? Like, explain literally everything to you, like for a Wikipedia article? I assume not, right?
Why, like Pocahontas came and helped Jon Snow do something with the people. I don't know.
Yeah, basically.
When I hear colonialism talked about, I feel like broadly it refers to two things. One can be a form of like cultural colonialism, so the idea that we export
Hmm.
culture across the world or something like that. That Western-centric views are prolific in media, entertainment, et cetera, et cetera. And then I hear like economic colonialization. So this might be in the form of exploitative trade deals,
Hmm.
the IMF. Or
Yeah.
just like straight out
Well, that's
like
more modern
companies
stuff.
that
Like,
like sure.
what I think we're talking about here is more like I guess like yeah, the stuff that you're talking about there, it's more like a adapted terminology rather than really having that much to do with it. But the colonialism that we're talking about in regards to decolonization, it's sort of like, think about like the initial colonization of the Americas, the USA, Australia, Canada, Africa, stuff like that. So much more direct rather than
Okay.
you using colonialism as a metaphor. And I guess like, hold on, I've made videos on this before, so I have like a definition sort of written up to sort of introduce here. The key thing is to remember here that like, calling someone like colonizer is not an insult, and it can be an insult, but it's not an insult by default, right? It's like describing sort of like a relation that they have, a societal relation. It's like calling someone working class or something, or bourgeois or something, Though a lot of people take it as an insult, a lot of people use it as an insult. I use it as an insult, but doesn't mean that it always has to be one, or that being a colonizer makes you a bad person or whatever,
Do you know what probably makes it sound like an insult?
That it's used as one.
Well, I think even I heard Professor Flowers say this. The act of colonizing someone is probably, I imagine we would both agree that it's an aggressive act.
Mm,
And usually when moral agents take aggressive acts, some sort of retribution can be justified.
yeah.
So I think that's why. So when somebody says like, "Oh, you're a colonizer," the implication is that like I need to be punished for it, not
Mm,
me, but whoever you're talking about. So that
I
would be my
think
guess
like
for why people.
ideally no one would want anything like that to happen, Like, if it's the same sort of thing with like, I assume like a fair bit about like theoretical socialism. Like no one wants there to be like just worthless, like for no good reason punishments of people who used to be like bourgeois or something just for the sake of it. But if these people were to like resist to the death or something, they wouldn't leave you with an option.
Mhm.
So it's
I also don't
like,
know if like even the term colonizer seems a little bit weird. Or I guess finish talking about that, and then I can just
mm,
ask about the concept.
um, well, I guess like for an example, a good example that all Americans understand. Think about like a conflict, like for example, the U.S. Civil War, where one
Hmm.
side was just unequivocally in the right, and the other side was just fighting for slavery, basically. And it's like, what if the Confederacy just refused to surrender forever? What would you have to do? Like, basically, just fucking beat them into submission, right? So no one wants that to happen. It could happen, right, in some sort of theoretical decolonization scenario. But I mean, I think basically everyone, at least other than like someone who thinks colonialism was a good thing, would agree that like decolonization, as in, places that are under like colonial rule or that either direct or that like, are ruled by the remnants of like a former colony, for example, South Africa was, for a good example that everyone knows. Like fighting against that is pretty much unambiguously like making you in the moral right.
What does it mean to fight against that, though? Like
Like
how, like
to,
let's say we have
well,
a
to use an
decolonial
example,
attitude in like the modern day. Like, what would be a way to
well,
fight
to use a
against?
good example, South Africa is another good one. So, apartheid ended in 1991. The struggle against apartheid was definitely a decolonial struggle. It might not have ended in like the best way it possibly could have, but it was definitely like a decolonial struggle, as in it was a struggle against this system that was set up by a group of people who had come to South Africa a couple hundred years earlier, sort of gradually conquered and subjugated people who had already lived there, put themselves at the top of like this society with those people below them, like legally everything. It might not have to be literally legal, but in this case it was very literal, so just a great example to use to start off. And so they did that. They put themselves at the top of this society with the people who already live there at the bottom, killed them, stole whatever the fuck they wanted, basically. And that resulted in the 20th century of like, the thing that everyone's familiar with, the apartheid South Africa. And so the fight against that was broadly, I guess, mostly focused on getting rid of that sort of system of like formal legal dominance, which was part of the colonial system in South Africa.
It didn't seem like this was a fight against colonialism. Doesn't this feel more like a fight against, say, like unjust oppression? Isn't that more what it's focused
Well,
on
unjust
rather than
oppression is it's a factor of colonialism, right?
Sure, but it just seems like it's kind of a weird way to frame it, like through colonialism rather than
Well,
like.
we're talking about a country that was quite literally colonized, right? And
Yeah,
that
sure, but I mean,
they're
like, let's say you had some country under some like authoritarian rule or whatever, and these people fought against the government because they viewed it as tyrannical or something, right? They could be fighting for all the same reasons that a colonized society might be fighting for. I mean, you could frame it that way, but I guess I always get hesitant when people try to frame like every single conflict through their particular lens or
yeah,
every
but I
part
mean,
of a
this
conflict.
isn't a lens that you can apply to like every situation ever. Just places where this sort of relation has been set up, and the way that it's set up is so basically, what we're talking about here in relation to South Africa and other places is like there's two types of colonialism interrelated. One is colonialism, which is more about like the extraction of wealth, for example, for the mother country, more so than implanting settlers or whatever to actually live there and develop their own society. And the other one is settler colonialism, which is sort of where rather than that the colony being formed to just extract resources, wealth, etc., for the mother country, it's rather formed, or it's either formed for the explicit purpose of, or ends up turning out as like its own sort of thing, right? Like a place where lots of settlers go, and they want to stay permanently, develop settlements in their own society, etc. But that alone isn't really it, right? Like if they did that, without like subjugating the people who already live there, like with some sort of non-coercive agreement, wouldn't be much of a problem with it. What makes it sort of settler colonialism is when they do that and they supplant and replace the pre-existing society rather than sort of fusing with it, becoming a part of it, or anything like that. And that sort of creates a sort of different sort of social relation where we have two groups of people. Like we can call them for this purpose, like I guess settlers, colonizers, or whatever. And the previous group of people, who you could call like indigenous, and that group who like came in and colonized are the ones who sort of dominate this new society. They pretty much unequivocally see the previous population as like a problem that's going to require some sort of solution, which is generally something like assimilation, extermination, deportation, or something like apartheid. So yeah, and I guess like settler colonialism in that respect sort of began in Ireland with the English, and then was sort of exported to the Americas, especially North America, some parts of Africa, etc. It's also been done by people who aren't European as well, like Japan, for example. But I guess that's basically it.
Sure. How is this relevant to like Western world stuff right now, or is this just like strictly used for like?
It's more relevant, I guess, the further along that things are in certain places, right? Like there's I guess it's relevant, but it's relevant at different levels. Like when I talk about like South Africa, right? Like that was a sort of example of like really evident, like the most evident ongoing colonialism imaginable. But it's a lot more subtle in other places. Like in the US, for example, you have like indigenous groups that are still existing who have basically a fraction of their original territory, if even, and you know, that struggle for their own sorts of their own like self-determination, their own rights, etc., is
Yeah, but like,
also
how
a
does that
struggle.
work? Like, what's the solution to that? Like, we're not. I don't even know if it'd be morally right to like give them the territory back. Like, how does that work?
Well, if I can make an analogy that a lot of people are much more familiar with, because you know it's difficult to introduce this to people who just haven't really thought about this that much, but people have thought about one example of colonialism a whole lot, which is Nazism. A lot of people, you know, we don't really think about it in these terms, but the Nazis were very clear that they saw their invasions of Eastern Europe as sort of a project of colonialism, just on like a very large and much more organized scale than ever before, really. And their goal was to sort of, you know, take the land from the people who live there, kill them, enslave them, deport them, or whatever, and take it for sort of German settlers, right? And we can ask the same sort of question about that. Like, okay, if colonialism, you know, if it would even be moral one day for someone who lives in this like hypothetical successful Nazi state or whatever that they took over, you know, the remnants of the people who lived there before them, who they're now like dominating or whatever, to rebel against that and be like, okay, this is, you know, I have a certain moral right to take this back or something like that. Like, do you think there would ever be a point where that group of people would not be able to say that? Because I think,
Yeah, I think
you know,
forever, probably when it comes to Europe, especially, right? Like, how do you ever figure, like, who does the moral right belong to say that they own some land originally? Like, haven't
well,
groups of, like Saxons, Germans, like Spain, haven't these people been fighting over territory in
yeah, the
Europe
difference
for
between
literally
this
thousands of years?
and this example, for example,
Uh-huh.
is like if we like a good example is like the like
Wait,
fourth,
wait, wait,
fifth
wait, hold on. Because
century.
every time I ask a question, I feel like we hop into like another analogy or metaphor.
This isn't a
So
metaphor.
let's
It's
just
like it's I'm using history
wait. So
to provide
let's
an
just focus
example
on
of the
like
difference.
sure, yeah, but I'm just curious. Let's just like on this particular thing, right? So let's say in Europe, let's say Hitler did conquer a ton of Germany, and then some people, let's say 200 years from now, there was some giant German country, and some people were like, well, no, we're gonna take the land back. Like in terms of taking it back, let's say that they do it. Wouldn't there just be some other group of people that are like, well, hold on, we're gonna take it back from you now, and then we're gonna take like, how do you decide who originally owned some piece of land?
I don't think
Like, is
that
there,
that's really how it works, right? Like you tend to have cultures sort of fusing together over time and stuff like that. Like it's not like they're going to be saying, oh, like I mean just for an
Communism is
example,
based.
for like a random analogy here that doesn't get too complicated, like, you know, Germans steal land from the Poles, and then but there's not going to be people who came before the Poles who were like claiming that land either, is there? Right? Because at that point, whoever they were, they're going to be essentially treated as exactly the same as the Poles and fused into them by like the Nazis or whatever, right? So it's
wait,
like,
what? You don't think? Hold on, because I'm gonna start asking my chat for this. So you don't think that anybody else in Poland besides Polish people would feel that they had a more original claim to that land? That's something that you feel strongly about? A lot of people in chat are
like
saying
what
that
people,
Celtic
like
people
Russians or something? Like
or
obviously
Celts,
by
a lot of
saying
people are saying
Poland,
he's
I'm not
super
speaking about Poles
hold
as
on.
like just an ethnic like, you know, the only ethnic group. I'm speaking about, you know, people who lived in Poland who weren't
Okay,
considered part of the Nazi project.
what about Celts?
Um, Celts Celts essentially fused into, you know, they don't exist anymore. So they fused into like essentially many generations ago, they fused into the rest of British society. That was actually an example that I was going to use. Well, not Celts specifically, but the British Isles specifically, right? Where like
Wait, so
so
there's
much.
no group of people that consider themselves like Celtic people anymore?
I mean,
Or
they can, but it's not like we have a group of people who consider themselves Celtic people without like a good example of this. I mean, I know you
hold
don't
on,
like
wait,
examples.
yeah, wait, no.
I have a
It's not
very
that I don't like
direct
it.
example to use here.
No. I want to talk about one thing because this is like you've hopped on like 3 or 4
Yeah,
different. Like,
I
here's an
am
example, here's a
historically
metaphor, here's an
literate. I
example.
use historical examples. These are not
No.
metaphors. These are the
Hold on,
practical examples of what I'm talking
don't.
about.
Okay, come on, we're having a conversation.
Yeah, so
Okay?
you need to
You
let
don't have
me
to
just
interject.
like.
Well,
I have
because you're what.
perfect example.
Okay, go for it.
Okay.
All right. I'm gonna bring, regardless of what you say, I'm just letting you know, I'm gonna bring you right back to this and ignore everything you're saying. But go ahead.
So basically, you're just ignoring something that's directly like you were going to ask me something very similar to this.
No,
But
what
go
I was
on,
gonna, what I
ask
was
the
gonna
question,
ask
ask
you.
the
Well,
question.
I'll state the. Okay, yeah. So the question is, so there are people that exist in Scotland and Ireland right now. I guess that consider themselves Celtic people. Could these people not say, well, hold on, if Polish people are going to say, I had an original right to that land, well, we're going to say our ancestors had more of an original claim to that land than you did.
This
And
isn't
then
this
how
isn't
do you
like
respond
based
to
on
that?
just like an ancestral claim, right? This is based on people like extant groups with like complete continuation from the groups that this land was originally stolen from. You know, people who still exist, right? We're not talking about like some random ancestral claim like, oh, my ancestors like 2,000 years ago lived here and I've randomly decided to identify with them, even though like their culture is long
why do you
gone or
think that's-
whatever.
Wait. So if the culture gets sufficiently genocided, then they no longer have a claim to the land?
I mean, if they literally don't exist anymore, then yeah, right? Like they don't exist anymore. How can they have a claim to the land? It doesn't make
How many
sense,
people
right?
how many people have to be like bred out of like indigenous American populations, Native American populations, for them to no longer have a claim to the original land? That seems kind of weird, no?
It seems like you're just kind of like going for random gotchas here rather than actually engaging with anything that I'm saying. So
Is this
how is it like, okay, you don't understand. I understand. Like you understand concepts like subconscious racism. That's essentially what this is.
hold on. Can I just
Communism
Like
is
let me-
based-
hold on,
something
can I
that you're
rephr-
taking
I'll
for
re-
granted is
can I
being
rephrase
challenged.
what I want to rephrase? It's not anything. You haven't challenged anything. I'm just trying to understand. What you're
Yeah, it is.
okay?
That's why
I'm gonna
like
read-
you've never engaged with this concept before, so obviously you're
that's why
having a
I'm
bit of a
trying to,
virulent
but you're
reaction to
so
it.
combative. You make it impossible just for me to ask.
I'm not
questions. So
combative at all. I'm
You're
I'm giving you
absolutely
good
being
examples. You're probably the most combative person in the entire world.
Can you're dead wrong. Okay. I'm
Okay,
gonna
show
rephrase
me.
what you're telling me, and then you tell me if it's accurate, and then we'll move from here. So we're on the same page.
Okay.
So it sounds like what you're saying is there are distinct groups of people possessing a certain culture that can be traced back to owning a certain type of land or being from a certain area. And when I say, well, what about the genetic ancestry? These people, you know, they could claim that their great ancestors owned some land. Your response is, I'm not talking about some who were the first group of genetic people there. I'm talking about some cohesive cultural thing that existed in an area. And as long as that still exists at some place in the world, that distinct culture has a claim to that land that they were originally from. So Celtic people in Scotland and Ireland have their own culture. They don't resemble that culture of the past anymore. Therefore, they don't have the same claim to that land that like Polish natives might or something. Is that
Well, if you could like prove that there was a like so-called Celtic people who had considered themselves Celtic, like as like sort of like a polity of Celtic people who have existed for a very long time, who have been oppressed under a like a settler colonial social relation, like continuously forever, blah blah blah, and this hypothetical group of people who literally do not exist, by the way, like existed in that sort of way, then yeah, obviously, but they don't. Celtic people don't exist anymore. Like remnants of Celtic culture absolutely exist, but they've been fused into like the wider culture, right?
Do you think that like those people could make the claim that like they've been colonized so successfully that their original culture is essentially genocided? So it's a little bit
Sure, like
it's a little bit unfair to say that like we've lost
they
our
could
claim
make that
because
claim,
we're-
but we're not talking about the same thing here, right? There's a certain point where this becomes basically unactionable.
Well, I think that's kind of we're nibbling around the edges of this, but the feeling is that all of this is kind of unactionable, which is what my big.
I mean,
push is
I
on
think
most.
the issue here is that you're just conceiving of this in terms that are very unfamiliar to you. So, like, what if we frame this, for example, let's say Russia
I'm consuming.
takes like all of Ukraine except like one city. They annex all of it. Because, I mean, this is like a reductionist example of what happened in the settler colonial states. Like, wouldn't that one little Ukrainian city remaining have like a moral claim to what had been taken from them?
I think that there's like an issue of like a matter of time changing that moral claim. I think this is why. So,
So,
for
like,
instance,
if Nazi Germany had conquered Eastern Europe, you think that, like, after 200 years, it would be theirs, basically?
yeah, I think some amount of time passed. I don't know what the generations is, or
I'm
whatever,
not
but
sure
yeah.
about the optics of that, but
But hold on, because now you sound like you're trying to.
Feels
get a
like
dunk,
he
okay?
supports
If
the
you want to go by
Holocaust.
Nazi
no,
Germany all
no.
the
If
time, that's
I
fine.
can go by
Wait,
Nazi
let me
Germany
finish-
because
let me-
you
let
live
me-
in
let me
you
finish
live in a
my one
state
sentence. Let me
that
finish
is
one
very
sentence,
analogous
please.
to
Let
Nazi
me just
Germany.
finish one sentence, please. Okay.
I've let you finish
The
many
entire
sentences.
history. You're not. You're very, very, very obsessed with the optics thing, right?
Okay.
The entirety. And you probably know more history than I do, okay? Which is, so if I'm wrong, feel free to correct me. But my understanding is that you've just described like the entirety of European history. That basically whoever, or at least like Western and Northern and Southern Europe, maybe not Eastern Europe or Southeast Europe, right? But it seems like for the entirety of European history, basically if you take over some land and then you own it long enough, and then we get to industrialization and we get to more stable forms of government, eventually like, okay, well, we've had this place long enough, it's basically ours. And then if you look at the actions of certain countries in the world, so like India and the Kashmir region, or if you look at Israel trying to settle people more and more east in Jerusalem, it seems like people are under the impression like, well, hey, as long as you're in some place for long enough, you more or less kind of like control it. That seems to be the history of the world. Is that not true?
I mean, I
or-
think that just because things are doesn't mean that's how things that is right or should be. But
Yeah, then
either
how do
way,
we
like
figure it out otherwise? Okay,
I
go
think
for it.
I think you might be like a lot of you know, when engaging with this for the first time, a lot of people have like the reaction like, oh, they're gonna kick me out or something like that. But
Okay,
that's
hold on.
not
Please
what's going on
don't
here
do
at
the
all.
dialogue tree. You're trying to like dialogue tree me so hard. Like this is the first
What is
time
a
you're.
dialogue
I'm not
tree?
like you have like the memorized talking points for like people that are.
I've literally never talked about this to someone.
Okay, I haven't given you a single indication whatsoever that I'm worried about getting kicked out of my country. That's not anything that I think about related to this. Okay, I haven't even remotely brought that up. Do you
But,
think I'm worried
okay,
that anybody
so
like you is
let
going
me
to kick me out of my
explain.
country?
Like,
Yeah.
let's,
Okay, go ahead.
Like you talked about Israel, right? Like decolonization in Israel wouldn't literally mean kicking out every Jew in Israel. At least nothing like that. It would be, for example, like creating one state where everyone has equal rights with people being prosecuted for human rights abuses and like stolen things, or at least, you know, stolen things that can be reasonably traced being returned to whoever they were stolen from. You know, very easy to explain. That's not very complicated, right?
Well, but I think that's incredibly complicated, right? Like even when the recent, no, I say recent, but a
Like
year or
you-
two ago or whatever.
Sorry, go
When,
on.
when there was a whole it was in that East Gate area in Eastern Jerusalem. There was a neighborhood that I think Palestinian families were getting kicked
Communism
out of.
is based.
The claim by the Israeli people was they didn't pay on time or something, and then the Palestinians alleged wrongdoing, and obviously both sides. But the problem is, it seemed like both sides were able to go back pretty far in terms of who originally had a right to this area.
Yeah,
and I think
so-
this building, yeah. So it's I'm just saying that like that process seems really complicated.
Yeah, I'm familiar with
You
the
guys said, like-
case.
well, okay, go ahead.
Sorry, did you want to say anything else?
No, that's it. It just
Communism
seems
is
complicated.
based-
Feels like he supports the Holocaust.
So that case, it's essentially based on like, this is a thing that happens in a lot of settler colonial states where like you know, they move in and they like write themselves documents that say this is
I'm
mine.
consuming.
You know? And that's essentially what happened there. Like, you know, Israel took over this area, and you know, they wrote themselves under their law that said that this is ours now. But there were people already living there, you know? And now these people are essentially renting something that previously was theirs because the settler society said, this is ours now, and, you know, we own it. So, yeah, you can trace things back to that, for example, but you can also trace things beyond that, beyond, like, before Israel decided to write itself a bunch of legal justifications for its ownership of the land.
I honest to God, I have to go back. Like my understanding is that like this particular area has been fought about for like 1,000 years. It wasn't just Israel writing themselves a note in the 50s or whatever.
Well, what happened in Israel, like if you want me to elaborate on that, I can. If you think it's too off topic, we don't need to.
I don't know if we have to necessarily get into this.
I think Israel's a pretty good example for your earlier concerns, actually, because you know Israel like 2,000 years ago was at least had a lot of Jews. I don't know if it was majority Jewish, but it had a lot of Jews, right? And over time, due to anti-Semitism and other reasons, they dispersed more across the region to Europe, etc. And so this goes back to the genetic claims, right? Like, you know, if you left a place like 2,000 years ago and you come back 2,000 years later and say, well, this is mine. Yeah, that would be ridiculous. It would be ridiculous not just for them, but for anyone else. Like, for example, if like a Native American left the USA, went to Europe, came back 500 years later, like the descendants came back 500 years later saying, hey, I have Native American blood, this is mine now. Yeah, that would be ridiculous. But what happened in Israel is those people, or at least the descendants of those people, came back and claimed off essentially religious mythology to be the legitimate owners of that land. There were Jews who had lived there continuously, but they were a rather small portion of the population. And also the Palestinians are descended from those, like genetically, the same people, right? As those. So it's essentially a religious mythology that created that sort of idea, not really anything real.
Isn't like then like under your prescription, wouldn't the goal be to like make sure that when you do take over some land, you kill as many people as possible so that they kind of like lose their right to it? Isn't that like where that kind of takes us?
I mean, the thing is, like, there's not actually any right to any of this, right? We're just sort of speaking in abstract, subjective morality.
Feels like he supports the Holocaust.
This, but I mean, in terms
Well, it
of
sounds like you're trying to say there's like a moral justification or whatever for certain groups of people to lay claims to
I'm
certain
consuming.
land,
I mean, you could apply that to basically anything, right? Like, you know, if, for example, after World War II, you don't want the Germans to become a problem again, you could kill them all, or you could like just not do that. Like, I think it's,
well, I guess
it's a
so, like
pretty absurd point to
if we're
make.
using like this colonialist framework, right? How would that apply to like modern day America?
Like for example, modern day America. Well, I think modern day, like indigenous people in modern day America have been incredibly thoroughly colonized, incredibly thoroughly beat down. You know, what you've basically got left is just like rather small individual, not even individual nations, but nations that have been fractured into different reservations and stuff, different regional distinction between them and stuff. If you were to look at like decolonization for the USA, like at least in practical terms, that would be actionable like in the short term rather than some sort of idealistic random vision. Like you would be looking at essentially like, you know, looking at the treaties that were violated, you know, things that I guess are very easily traceable. It does become a lot harder as time goes by, obviously. In Israel, it's easier because that's a lot more recent. But, you know, at least in the USA, things that are very actionable are stuff like violated treaties. You know, they have like literal coordinates in them that you can demarcate that say, you know, this should have been these people's or whatever, and sort of move on from there.
Would that be like the more moral? We'll ignore the fact that realistically this is probably not going to happen. But like, let's say that theoretically there was some way we could even enact this. Would it then be moral to expel all the groups of people currently living there to return this land to us?
Certainly not. No, certainly not. I don't think anyone's really talked about expulsion aside from like as, you know, sort of like a irrational, retribute. I don't know, like attempt at retribution. You know, like.
Sure. But what exactly are you saying then, or what is the?
So, well, I guess. Think about it like sovereignty being transferred to a different group, or perhaps not even sovereignty. Like, you know how, you know, maybe they want to remain a part of the USA just with autonomy or whatever, like they are now. Who knows? It's on them. But it doesn't entail like literally kicking people out.
Well, but what if you give those people sovereignty there and they want to, wouldn't they have the right to do it? I
mean, generally when we talk about these questions in self-determination, for example, this is international law stuff. Self-determination is at least in international law. I mean, you probably agree with it, but it's sort of predisposed on the idea that like it can't be self-determination for the purposes of like you know, kicking people out, for example. Like, you know, the South, if the Confederate USA had claimed self-determination, that would have been bullshit because they wanted to do it to oppress black people. You know, stuff like that. Like it's conditional, right? So you could
Well,
definitely judge
what would
if it's righteous or not
self-determination
based on
and get
that.
these people the ability to do then? What's the point of being
Well,
self-determined then? If you...
what's the point of being like an independent nation if you want to be? I mean, this is a fairly basic principle of even liberalism, right? Like, I'm so, you know, if the people of Hong Kong wanted to be independent, wouldn't you support that?
I mean, for the people of Hong Kong as a Westerner, I probably would, but I mean, it depends on, sovereignty isn't always necessarily a good thing, no?
I mean, I agree. It's not always necessarily a good thing, but there is sort of very generally accepted principle of self-determination in international law. I mean,
I don't know.
pretty much
I think
everyone agrees on
there's
it.
a lot of principles of cooperation as well, though, right? Like self-determination, isn't that violated to some extent by the European Union? Like,
yeah, I understand what you're saying.
You
There were,
federalize
like, you know,
powers, you have central bodies, or like I wouldn't support like the self-determination of like the state of Texas
yeah,
or
obviously.
something like that, right? Well,
Yeah,
hold on, don't say obviously, right? So there are some cases where like having just like a bunch of self-determining countries or whatever isn't necessarily ideal for everybody. Sometimes even the people in those countries, right? It just depends.
Yeah, but
on,
I think it doesn't necessarily have to be ideal. Like, we don't really make these decisions on what's ideal, rather what on, you know,
Communism
people
is
want,
based.
more so than anything else. Like, you know, if people want to, you know, like, say if I'm someone who likes the USSR or something, if I was principled and I was like, hey, you know, Ukraine wants to be be an independent country, even if I think that it would be better as part of the USSR, you know, that's for them to decide, right?
sure.
So, like, yeah, you could think it's going to be a bad thing for them or something, but still, we're talking about a situation here, at least in terms of the US. Like, I understand what you mean with like the difficulty of tracing these things, right? But in the US, you can trace these things back to like actual legal documents, supposedly binding legal documents and stuff in terms of treaties and stuff. So that's a very good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, a starting point. I just don't know what the outcomes. Like realistically, it's unlikely that any of those more extreme treaties are going to be enforced. I think at best you probably hope for some sort of financial compensation.
Well, I mean, in some places, yeah, definitely, at least in, you know, sort of a short-term realistic thing. But like, I think, you know, the notion that, like, for example, if like, let's say there's like, this doesn't exist, but if there was like a reservation of like, say 500,000 people, say like half of them were native, half weren't, and they wanted to declare independence, and, you know, I think that would be fairly unambiguously something they should have the right to do.
How do you feel about like Quebec and Canada? Do you think that Canada is in the wrong for trying so hard to keep Quebec as part of the country? Or?
Well, Quebec in the first place is also a settler colony itself, right? Like, it was French people who took over indigenous land themselves, though the French were much better than the English were. But yeah,
really
and like on like an immediate sense, yeah, and Canada actually did allow Quebec numerous referendums in the matter, from what I understand. And if they had passed, then yeah, Quebec should have been allowed to be independent.
Okay. If any group of people inside a country just says that they want to be independent, should they be allotted that? Like, so if, say, Texas takes a vote and then like 60% of people in Texas are like, we want to be our own country, is that just something then that you allot those people?
I guess it depends. Like, in a lot of cases, like, for example, sorry for using an example, like, I know we don't like these, but, you know, there's like the Catalonia issue, which was happening like 5-6 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, where Catalonia wanted to, or at least a significant amount of Catalonians, I don't know if it was a majority or not, wanted to declare independence from Spain, but the Spanish essentially completely said no. So, in like a practical standpoint, if Texas wants to declare independence, that's not going to be allowed to. From like a moral standpoint, it depends on the reasons. For one, you know, there's parts of Texas, at least, that are unceded indigenous land, for one. Just from even a US legal sense, they should be, at least, if they were consistent with their original laws.
Well, I'm not concerned with like all the minutia of like what for
so if we ignore that, then
yeah, or like couldn't any arbitrary group of people like declare an independence? Like, let's say everybody in my neighborhood was like, we want to be our own country, like we don't want to pay these taxes or whatever, like we want to form a country. Like,
I mean, you could try
like
to if you want to, but in terms of like a practical sense, obviously there's like a, you know, like a threshold where this becomes relevant, right? Like, yeah, you can reduce it like that, but we got to talk about this in terms that are actually remotely actionable. That's why I gave an example, for example, 500,000 people. There's countries, entire countries with 500,000 people.
Okay.
And like, maybe that wouldn't even be the case. You know, like maybe indigenous people would want to, for example, remain part of the USA as, you know, maybe as like a more autonomous territory, but still subject to federal law or something like that. Like they're basically like that already now, but, you know, perhaps not quite as autonomous as they would like to be, and without a lot of the resources that were stolen from them, because reservations were mostly given to them in parts that were considered to be mostly worthless, for example. But, you know, they might want to do that. That would also be good.
Gotcha. Do you want to talk to, or is there anything else you'd want to talk about?
I mean, no, if you don't have any more questions about that.
Okay. Do you want to talk to Haas?
What does he want to talk about?
I don't know, but he was screaming in my Twitch chat earlier.
He wants to debate about shit like who's the manliest man or something. I think that might be funny, but probably not worth anyone's time.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, hey, if you don't have anything else, thanks for the conversation, buddy.
Yeah, no problem, buddy. Nice talking to you.
Yep, have fun, bye.
See ya. You know, he wasn't trying to like legitimately understand me there. He was just trying to like find loopholes to go for a gotcha. That's what these people do. He didn't seem very interested. He wanted blood sports. He didn't get them. So now he's pissed. What about the kicking people out thing?
Well, all right. Well, hey, if you don't have anything else, thanks for the
Oh my god!
Yeah, no problem, buddy. Nice talking to you.
Yep, have fun, bye.
Holy shit, he ran away. I wanted to debate about decolonization. I didn't want to fucking talk about manliness. Damn, it sounds like he's scared. Damn. Well, I mean, look, to be fair, look, we're not going to bully him. We're not bullies. He's a protected guy on Twitch. So here's what I'm going to say. He's very nervous when he talks to people in VC. He's very different from how he sounds when he types. And Destiny's quite a cordial person to talk to in general. You know, Destiny's not going to do it, you know. So I can only imagine the level of nervousness he would have talking to me, which would probably just be beyond the threshold of possibility. Yeah, he, you know, clicked his heels and he was off as soon as he heard my name.
You know, the dominating population, I said this earlier in that talk, if the dominating population, like, resists to the point that you have to do that, then yeah, that would be righteous, absolutely. And definitely at least appropriating from them is absolutely righteous. If they want to leave after being appropriated, that's fine. That's essentially like what happened in Zimbabwe, for example, was the settler population were being told by Britain that if they wanted independence from Britain, they needed to first, because they were still a British colony at the time, they needed to first ensure that there would be no white minority rule, because the British, as bad as they are, still didn't want to create another South Africa. So the white population declared unilateral independence from Britain. This is only the second time this has happened after the US. Usually, like the settler colonies of Britain were given their independence. So in that case, they took basically every measure possible to maintain their dominance of the society, to maintain their apartheid system, to maintain the land that they had stolen from the colonized people. And the indigenous population obviously reacted with violent resistance to that because they had no other option, right? They were left no other option. The only realistic option when you're faced with that sort of thing is to make fucking armies and fight it. So they did that. So the Rhodesians, as they called themselves, lost after trying to, with violent force, to maintain a brutal system of colonial oppression. And after that, the indigenous population appropriated the land holdings of rich former colonizers. They didn't kick them out, they appropriated. They left, most of the white Zimbabweans who were former big landowners left after that happened because they, once they lost their land, once they lost the system of racial oppression that made them rich, they had no reason to be there anymore. Now, what happened after that was, you know, the land was allocated very poorly. because like some groups on the indigenous side gave it to their cronies and shit rather than allocating it equitably to people who knew how to use it. And there were a lot of black people who obviously knew how to use it because they were the ones who had been doing the farm labor for generations, okay? White people didn't get their fucking hands dirty. It was the black people who worked for them. So people use that as an example of, oh, black people don't know how to farm. Decolonization bad. But the appropriation wasn't the bad thing. The bad thing was the poor, essentially what was a poor land redistribution, poor land reform. There's been good examples of land reform. For example, Cuban land reform was overwhelmingly successful. That's just one example. And that is an example that is very extreme because it's an example where like the colonizer population basically resisted even the most milquetoast simplest reform. Like, hey, give black people equal rights. Don't even give them anything economic. Give black people equal rights. That's it. And they still couldn't even do that. So what do you expect after that? Now, obviously, I think that decolonization needs to be more than just equal rights, you know, because we're talking about shit that was literally stolen from the people who are now poor. You give them equal rights, well, they're poor. The colonizers are still rich from off base of what they stolen, so there needs to be something done there, right? I think the best thing is appropriation or at least reparations or something. I guess framing this through the lens of reparations is a good way to get people who might not understand this very well to understand it. Because a lot more people understand reparations.
White rights, of course.
Xander Hall, shut up. A lot more people understand reparations than I guess understand that. I mean, there's been appropriations in history, like Cuba appropriating land from foreign bourgeoisie, right? That was good. I'm glad that happened. Not much different to appropriating stolen land from colonizers. So there's frameworks of understanding this.